Hey Know Why listeners, I want to talk today about the commodification of Christianity. Now this isn't my term, but it was coined by Freya India, at least in this article that she wrote recently on her Substack. It was later republished by the Free Press, but I'm going to link the original article that she posted on her blog. I think it is so insightful and so urgent for Christians to talk about, and I already know I want to hear from you, so I really hope that you will comment wherever you're listening, if you're on YouTube, or you can comment at knowwhypodcast.com and let me know what you think. So according to what Freya India writes, she's Gen Z. She's a really insightful voice on a lot of the issues plaguing Generation Z, especially with relation to social media and the digital age. And by her own account, she is new to Christianity. In fact, I'm not sure she's officially converted to Christianity, but she gives the church a wake-up call and a reality check that just blew me away by how relevant it was and how urgent this issue is. Because as we've talked about here, as I've talked about on Point of View, we are hearing a lot of conversation culturally about whether or not there are any sort of rumblings of a revival among Gen Z. Is church attendance really going up? What do Gen Z believe spiritually? And we've talked about this a lot, but how are they encountering Christianity, and how are we reaching out to them? So I want to talk about what she writes about. Like I said, it's super important. And let me just start by what she says here towards the beginning of her blog post. Learning about faith feels easier than ever. You can follow Christian influencers, listen to Christian podcasts, scroll through Christian hashtags. The Bible is bite-sized now. To stay connected with God, all we need to do is subscribe, download, and press play. So I think she makes an obvious point that it is easier in one way to learn about Christianity, or any religion, honestly, that you want to learn about, because it's just so accessible. There are so many digital tools and platforms and shows and apps and everything, like she said, available to teach people about it. But then it starts to kind of get a little bit questionable. She calls it the commodification of Christianity because, as you know, if you've ever used any sort of app, whether that's the YouVersion Bible app or Hallow, which is, I believe, the Catholic prayer app, or anything like that, you can get premium versions. You can subscribe, and you can pay, and you can, oh, don't even get me started on the extreme version of this, which is the AI Jesus chatbot, where you can literally pay a certain amount each month to get a certain number of minutes where you can chat with Jesus. Now, I don't think I've directly addressed that on the Know Why podcast. I know I've talked about it on Point of View, but if you've listened to the Know Why podcast at all, you should know enough about me and my opinions on AI and what I believe is important to the Christian faith to know that I am so against this. I think this is so dangerous and deceitful. First of all, you can't commune with God via a chatbot. He doesn't talk to us that way. And to try to get people to pay and tell them that that's how they're going to be able to talk to Jesus, that is just so messed up. But that's an extreme version. But there are other versions where, again, it's like, even if I click on the Bible app that I have on my phone, there's a premium version. There's also the gamification of faith, where if you keep going, you can keep your streak up and things like that. And I get why, people do this on language learning apps like Duolingo, even like Wordle, which actually is a game on the New York Times app. It'll, have a streak. And again, I do have the YouVersion Bible app on my phone. So it pops up and says streaks to help you build your daily Bible habit. And so people, app developers, ministries, they use these techniques to try to keep people coming back to their product, their app, right? There's a danger here because Freya India goes on to say, some of this seems helpful. And being new to Christianity, I can't pretend it's not convenient. I've never read the Bible all the way through, but I have an app that summarizes it for me and that texts me a passage every day. But I don't know. Lately, I'm beginning to feel as if Christianity has become another thing to do on my phone. That is so insightful. And she just goes on to reaffirm that. She says, now I need my faith fast and convenient. I can pray as I go. I can stay prayed up. I've got a streak going. And so I think this really should cause us to pause and ask ourselves, both from a user perspective and maybe like a ministry or outreach perspective, what's the motivation here? What habits are we forming in ourselves or helping other people to form? And are they actually the kind of habits that are going to bring somebody closer to God or really transform their life? Number one, just from a user perspective, I think it's problematic when our default becomes the fast and convenient version of the Bible or of faith. Like, she even has a line in here, just give Jesus 30 seconds, okay? Here, I'll just read this whole part because it's so good. She says, get used to playing a game and reality becomes boring. How on earth am I going to get through the book of Psalms when I'm used to iBible? Now I need the New Testament to be YouTube Shorts. Sure, I can take a minute to connect with God, but then it better be just a minute, and anything more is agonizing. Don't worry, my apps reassure me. It's just a few minutes a day. All right, just 1 minute. Actually, just give Jesus like 30 seconds. But that is so true for our fast-paced culture, is that we just want it quick and easy and on the go. And one of the really insightful things that she says, and this is from kind of the user perspective of, okay, people who are using these apps trying to grow in their faith, is that we have to be very, very careful about what is supposed to be a supplement becoming a substitute. So I'm somebody who, I grew up in a Christian household. I grew up going to church more than once a week, had physical Bibles, had to sit in the sermons. You know, I saw my parents reading their Bibles. I saw other adults around me opening up their physical Bibles during the sermon and turning to the passage that we were reading. And I developed those habits as I grew in my own faith. And like I said, I do have the Bible app, but it's definitely not my go-to. It is more what you might use occasionally. Like if I'm out and about and I'm trying to think of a specific Bible verse, maybe I will look it up on the Bible app instead of just Googling the reference because I can't remember exactly where it's found. Or sometimes I will use it because it has an audio version as well. So if I'm on a walk or driving somewhere and I want to listen to a passage of scripture, then I might use the audio version. But it's definitely not something that I use every day. It's more of just like that convenience thing of just in case I don't have a physical Bible with me and I need to reference something in the Bible, I can look it up in this app on my phone. So in that way, yeah, it is convenient, but that's not forming me. But here's where she gives the wake-up call that I think a lot of Christians need to realize. Like maybe if you have been a Christian for a long time, you're thinking, well, it's not a big deal. Like these things are just meant to like supplement kind of the way I described using them. But hold on, wait a second. Think about somebody who is a young adult, a digital native coming to the faith for the first time ever right now. She says, I don't think this helps new Christians, especially not Gen Z Christians. The problem with religious apps is the same problem we have with Instagram communities or with online porn. We encounter the virtual version of everything first before the real thing. And so that becomes our standard. Supplements become substitutes. That is so important. We have to understand. And if you are a millennial or up, if you are like me and you had a childhood that was not initially formed by screens, especially the little kind, like on the phone or even an iPad, if you had any formative portion of your childhood free from that, then I think you and I do not really understand what it's like to be a true digital native, somebody who was raised on phones and iPads from the time they were little, where they literally are encountering everything digitally before they encounter it physically. And that is what becomes more real to them. There's this term that I encountered in, I believe it was Neil Postman's book, which I'm going to reference a few times in the next few minutes, called hyperreality. And he was actually using this term to describe a time when print was the primary media in American culture. And there was this kind of phenomenon where people began to consider something as being more real or more legitimate if they saw it in print than if they saw it in real life. And it's kind of the version of what we have now of pick or it didn't happen. Like as in college, my friends and I used to joke, if we don't post it on Facebook, is it even real? Ha. But we weren't realizing that even we were older, we weren't little kids, but already those digital platforms, young as they were becoming a way for us to legitimize things on the World Wide Web. And so now hyperreality is something that a lot of people, especially young people, struggle with because they have encountered most things in life digitally first. And so that becomes real. What they see online or what they post online or their online version of themselves that they portray to the world becomes more real to them than what's actually physically real. And so I just think that that's so important for us to realize, okay, if that's how somebody is being discipled initially, is digitally versus physically in person with other real life Christians in a real life physical church, then that's going to be a problem. And even for us more mature Christians, we have to be really careful because the lure of convenience is so potent that it is so easy for us, even if we have been formed by real habits over the course of our faith journey, we can easily get sucked into the supplement and turn it into a substitute. Just take the example of online church. Back in the days of televangelists, there were, if you were in one of those big mega churches where the main pastor was actually a televangelist, then yeah, maybe your church service was broadcast. Or maybe some local mega churches had their services broadcast on like the local satellite channels or something like that. But the average church was not having their service either broadcast on TV or live streamed. But now I think the majority of churches in America are live streamed. Like their services are available online on the internet. And of course, there are some legitimate use cases for this where maybe, for shut-ins, people who are bedridden or they're sick or things like that, it does allow them to be able to maybe connect with their home congregation. But this norm really became accelerated during the COVID pandemic, and people warned then that if people got used to the convenience during the pandemic, which was supposed to be a temporary thing of watching church online, a lot of them wouldn't come back. And that is what unfolded. And it also accelerated a consumerist mindset toward the church, which is really where instead of viewing church attendance as something that we're supposed to do according to what the Bible says and engaging and communing with the body of Christ, the consumerist mindset says it's just another form of entertainment. Basically, it's 1 or 2 hours of entertainment per week. It's a product, and I as the consumer get to choose which product I prefer. So even before streaming church services became the norm, if you grew up in church, you heard of the term church hopper. That was somebody who was so picky. I'm not talking about theological differences or concerns or things like that, but they were just picky about superficial preferences. Like, well, I didn't really like, the voice of the worship leader there, or I didn't like the way that pastor spoke, or, we don't really like this, we don't really like that. And they would just hop around until they found a church that exactly fit their preference. And they, again, were viewing it not as really something to be a part of, but just something to consume. Well, with online church, it's so much easier because you can just scroll through a bunch of live streams and watch whatever version of church you feel like watching that day. And then it's the same with all of these apps. You can follow whatever preacher you want. You can watch whatever reels you want. You can use whatever app you want because it's much more consumerist. It's commodified. It becomes entertainment. So if that is how people are encountering the faith, and if that's the attitude that they are bringing towards it, then that's problematic. And again, for those of us who are mature Christians, that can be so dangerous because again, it's that convenience. It tugs at something that is already in our heart, which is the temptation of selfishness to make ourselves the center of the world. And whenever we get out of the habit of doing something good, when we get out of a good habit, it's really easy to fall into a bad one. So like with live streaming, that is not normal for me. I rarely ever watch my church via live stream. If anybody from my church is listening or watching this, if I miss a church service because I'm out of town or something, I'm actually really bad about watching it later. And I want to because I don't want to miss like the sermon series that we're in, but it's just so not normal for me to watch church online because I'm used to, from my life, church means going to church. It means physically going somewhere. But if you do watch church online so frequently that becomes the norm, it starts to stop feeling weird when you do it. And then I think that's where you're in danger of taking something that is supposed to be a supplement, like India says, and turning it into a substitute. So those are some things for us to consider from kind of the user perspective, whether we're a new Christian or a more mature Christian that's walked with the Lord for a long time. What does our use of these, digital faith tools, so to speak, really say about us? We put our time in what we value. So if we are in such a rush as a mature Christian that our Bible study and our time of communing with the Lord every day has gotten condensed down into just, a minute, or give Jesus 30 seconds, and we're using our apps as our primary way of encountering God's word rather than the supplement they're supposed to be, that's a problem. And then if it's a young person who is a digital native and that's the first time they're encountering Christianity at all, and that's how they're getting formed, then again, I think that's a problem because it's encountering the digital version of something, the less real version of something before the real thing. Now, I do want to talk about this from the outreach perspective just for a moment because, from the perspective of a church or a ministry, I think this poses kind of an uncomfortable question that we need to wrestle with, which is, where's that balance between meeting somebody where they are and then never actually bringing them to where they're supposed to be? When I was growing up in my day of being a teenager and in youth group era and all that, I think the big kind of theme that a lot of churches had was relevance. They wanted to make youth ministry relevant because they knew young adults weren't really coming to church. They were already starting to fall away. So they wanted to make it fun and attractive and cool. And that didn't really work out because I think what they realized in retrospect is that the church should be something different. It shouldn't be just another place that teens can go to play some games and then hear a pep talk at the end. That might as well go to, sports practice or hang out at the YMCA or whatever. Why would you come to church if it's not that different? So I think we can make the same mistake today if we're not careful, where we focus so much on going out to the places where people are to evangelize that we actually fail to, what's supposed to just kind of plant a seed and entice somebody or motivate, encourage somebody to come in and get a taste of the actual thing, that just becomes where we stay and where they stay. So I read Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman for the first time a few months ago, and he has a chapter on TV preachers, televangelists, and this was written in the 80s. So everything he said about TV is so much more relevant now when you apply it to social media, which just basically accelerated everything that he warned about in here. But one of the things I really wrestled with, because I have heard stories of people who maybe heard the gospel for the first time via televangelist and their life was changed in that moment. But he argues that these TV preachers, television preachers as he calls them, are the enemy of true religious experience. And here's why. What makes these television preachers the enemy of religious experience is not so much their weaknesses, but the weaknesses of the medium in which they work. Most Americans, including preachers, have difficulty accepting the truth, if they think about it at all, that not all forms of discourse can be converted from one medium to another. So he goes on, they, meaning the TV preachers, have assumed that what had formerly been done in a church or in a tent and face-to-face can be done on television without loss of meaning, without changing the quality of the religious experience. And then he goes on and says, this is gross technological naivete. If the delivery is not the same, then the message, quite likely, is not the same. And I think we need to wrestle with that in the age of digital media and in terms of church outreach, when so many Christian ministries, including the one that I'm involved with, are like, okay, how do we get more active online? How do we reach people where they are? And it makes sense because meeting people where they are today means online. You are not going to most likely find teens that need to be evangelized hanging out around at the street corner, but online, on TikTok, on Instagram, on YouTube. And so don't you want to take the message of the gospel to those places? Don't you want to preach truth and hope and tell people about Jesus on those platforms where they're spending their time? It makes sense. But then how much is being lost in translation? How much can truly be communicated that way? And so this is where I don't really know the answer, but I think that is the question that we have to wrestle with as Christians in terms of the outreach side of this conversation. I did an interview recently with somebody on Point of View Radio Talk Show, and she was talking about evangelism. And I can't remember the exact number, but she was saying, citing some statistics, saying that people typically have to hear the gospel multiple times before they actually make a faith decision. And she was saying that so that as Christians, we wouldn't feel discouraged if maybe a conversation we had didn't immediately bear fruit that we could see, or maybe we feel like we were obeying something, that God told us to do, like a conversation with someone, but we didn't see a conversion or something like that, because maybe that wasn't the time that, God in his infinite knowledge is going to at work and actually transform their heart. Maybe our part was just planting a seed, one of the seeds along the way. And this aligns with, what the Bible says too. Jesus uses a whole parable to talk about sowing seeds. And so I think the question for us with regards to digital media and reaching the next generation, as we talk about, so many Christian ministries are talking about all the time, the question for us is, what's sowing a seed to actually get somebody curious or interested in Christianity and encourage them to actually get involved physically and personally? And when does that seed cross the line and actually become an obstacle to them getting plugged in a real personal and physical way in a real life church? And I think that line right now, I think it's blurry. I think it's fuzzy. If you ask Freya India, who wrote this article that I've been referencing, she would err on the side of just not even messing, not even trying to find that line. I think to wrap everything up, and this is where, again, I do really want to hear from you. If you are involved in ministry somehow, if you have been on the receiving end of some sort of evangelizing or seeing some sort of encouraging content on social media, and I know this is ironic because I'm talking to you via YouTube right now about this, I want to hear your perspective because, like I said, I really don't have a definite answer on this. I just know that this is a conversation that we need to be having. But I think I will just end with her words because they're so important for our reflection. And again, you can find her whole article in the show notes below. She says all of this, the commodification and the gamification and the online communities, ultimately leaves us with a shallow faith. If you teach a generation Christianity through TikToks and Instagram Reels, don't be surprised if their version of belief has nothing to do with virtue, with how they actually live their lives, and everything to do with what they post, how they label themselves online, and what's on their story. Don't be surprised if Christianity becomes nothing but a weapon in the culture war, a cross emoji in a bio. She says, going on to the end, maybe in the future many of us will say we found Jesus through a YouTube short that God got recommended by our algorithm, but I doubt it. I think if Christians want to reach my generation, really reach us, they have to promise something totally separate from that, something otherworldly, something that doesn't abide by market logic, something different, divine, something, for once, that isn't cheapened or commodified. And I hope some find the conviction to say that their faith is too complicated, too sacred to turn into TikToks. If you want to know more about it, the subscription button won't help. You'll have to step into a church. Please let me know what you think of this question and of these words by Freya India. Comment below, and I'll see you next week on the Know Why podcast.